Okay, guys, welcome to class number 2 in Halacha, men's beginners Halacha. We started last week speaking about the intro to Halacha. So this week, B'ezrat Hashem, we're going to close up the ending of the history of Halacha, and then let's talk about, let's actually start getting into actual Halacha. Okay, guys, I'm going to share a screen right now. I'm going to share my notes with you. Okay, guys. So we spoke last time. We started beginning the history of Halacha. We spoke about when did Halacha actually start officially? When was it binding on the Jewish people? When did we have to start keeping Jewish law? When did every adult male, adult female actually become obligated by God to be a Jew? So we said it was Mount Sinai. We had questions about Abraham, about Sarah, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Esav, even. We had a bunch of questions. But the official Halacha being Halacha took place on Mount Sinai. We said at Mount Sinai, God came to us, gave us either 2 or 10 commandments. Afterwards, Moshe Rabbeinu learns the whole Torah, comes down with 2 Torahs, an oral Torah that he's going to teach to us for the next 40 years in the desert. And then he's going to write down the written Torah either piece by piece or at the end of his life. That becomes the Torah Shebichtav, the main Chumash of the Torah Shebichtav, of the written Torah, along with the oral Torah. And then from there, Torah started to expand. Okay, so that's what we got up to last time. Then it expanded, and the Nevi'im were written, the Ketuvim were written. Anybody know the difference between Nevi'im and Ketuvim? Guys, Nevi'im and Ketuvim, unmute yourself if you know the answer. What's the difference between Navi and the Ketuvim? Anybody know? Nevi'im, Ketuvim, prophets and writings. What's the difference? Anybody know? Guys, relax. Not all at once right now. Not all at once. Huh? Nobody knows what it. Okay, what does Nevi'im mean? Nevi'im?
Is it prophets?
Prophets.
Ketuvim?
Writings.
What are the writings? I mean, what books make it in the writings? What books make it in the prophets? Yeah. Fine. So the prophets, the Navi, that's like the book of Joshua, of Samuel. It goes through all the prophets and what took place and all the messages that God gave them in the Navi times. And that's like from after Moses died until the Jews be kicked out of the first kingdom of Israel. That's the prophet zone. The writings is like the book of Esther, the book of Ruth. We like the Tehillim, the Psalms that we say. Those make up the books of writings. A lot of those books were written at the exact same time as the prophets, sometimes by the same prophets. But what's the difference? The prophets, that's like God speaking down from above, coming down to us, giving us the messages. While the writings, while it's also divinely inspired, it's like from down below, how we think, how we approach things. You can have books in there like Mishlei and Shira Shirim, which is much more from our perspective of how we relate to God. So a lot of it overlapped. The actual writings itself is going to go all the way up until the return of the Jewish people after the story of Purim, when we come back and begin to rebuild the second temple. And that's the Torah Shebichtav, that's the written Torah. Now, along the whole way, the oral Torah is being discussed. They're having Beit Din, Sanhedrins, they're having Anshe Kesek Gdolas, they're having big groups of courts coming together, and they're discussing laws. And they're fighting it out amongst each other, but it's not written down. Because God didn't want to write it down. We spoke last week, why do we have an oral Torah? But then, life gets a lot worse. We build a second temple gets destroyed, Romans come along, they're doing some terrible stuff to us. We've gone already through one exile, we're beginning a second exile, and life is difficult, especially life in Israel, as well as life in the exile. So what's happening? We're beginning to have laws be made against us that we can't learn. And it's going from one generation to the next generation. And we're going to be killed if we're going to be Jewish. We have the famous game we play, we're spinning the dreidel. It's supposed to remind ourselves of like the Maccabees hiding in the caves, learning Torah so nobody catches them. And these things aren't far away. In the Soviet Union, we have the exact same stories that took place less than 100 years ago. So we have ourselves these stories throughout Jewish history of Jews like hiding their Torah. But when that's the way of learning Torah, the level of Torah knowledge starts to go down. The level of remembering things starts to go down. So comes along the leader of the Jewish people, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, his name is also known as Rebbe. Rebbe comes along in the year 200, he goes, we got to write it down. We got to write it down, because if we don't write it down, even though it's supposed to be oral, we have to write down the base laws, or else we're going to forget it, it's not going to work. We as a Jewish people can't handle it, and he makes a special exception for the Jewish people that in the old days you could only write down oral Torah for your own personal notes. But he's like, no, we can actually write official books, and that's known as the Mishnah. The Mishnah is divided into 6 categories that goes based on holiday laws, agricultural laws, marriage laws, and it really goes through the topics very organized, 6 sections. It goes through it. That's called Mishnah, and we teach our little kids Mishnah. My 8-year-old right now is studying Mishnah, and he's beginning to learn how to memorize it here in Israel. There's actually schools here in Israel that will memorize Mishnah, and by the age of 15, they'll know it all by heart, which is a crazy accomplishment. And even in America, there's some groups that are starting to do that. You probably, in some of your high schools or on Shabbats or stuff, you might have read a Mishnah here or two over there. But in America, they're much more into ideas. Canada is more into idea building, less into necessarily fact building. But here in Israel, they're still more into that. So even till today, little kids learning Mishnayot, they'll get candies for it. That's the base of the oral Torah. Fast forward 200 years in Israel, 100 more years in Babel and Babylonia. At this point, the exile has reached a point where the main centers of Judaism are basically in Israel and in Babylonia. But in Babel and Babylonia and Iraq, it's actually a stronger Torah community than in Israel. Life was hard in Israel, and they write down what's called the Gemara. They first write it down in Israel called the Yerushalmi, the Yerushalmi Gemara, known as the Yerushalmi Talmud, because the Talmud, which friends in yeshiva are studying right now, is you take the Mishnah, Talmud, and the Gemara, put it together. The Gemara is going to be this explanation of the Mishnah. They put it all into one book known as the Talmud. The Yerushalmi, though, was actually not written in Yerushalayim. It wasn't written in Jerusalem because Jerusalem was already destroyed. It was written in areas in the Galil, next to Tveria, Tiberias, areas like that. It was not written in Yerushalayim, but that was the Talmud of Israel. And then in Babel and Babylonia, they wrote another Talmud, another Gemara, and that's the main book that's studied today in yeshivas, which goes in depth to understand the Mishnah. Also will give you a lot of counter opinions, bring in a lot of philosophy, a lot of math, a lot of ideas, mysticism, stories. It goes through everything in the Gemara, and it's a lot of fun. For those of you that have studied Talmud in the past, you probably have enjoyed it somewhat. For those that haven't, maybe you'll start to this year, B'ezrat Hashem. But it's a cool book that's going to build your brain, your emunah, your faith, your everything. That is the Talmud. Okay, let's keep fast forwarding. So history is going on from the period of the Talmud, from around the year 500. For the next 500 years, what's happening with halacha? The next 500-600 years, what's happening with halacha? People are asking questions. They're asking questions. The exile of the Jewish people is getting a lot more complicated. At this point, the first real communities are being set up in Spain, which is going to lead to the Sephardic Jewry. But really, it's being set up all over North Africa. As people were running away from Israel, they were setting up shop in Egypt. They're setting up shop in Morocco, Tunisia. They're setting up shop all the way up to get into Spain. That's going to become a major center of Judaism. It's going to begin in the 700s, in the 800s, 900s, get much stronger in the year 1000, 1100. At the same time, it's beginning as well in Ashkenaz. First in France and Germany, that's where the major centers of Ashkenazi Jewry is beginning, a little bit in England as well. And then over the next hundreds of years, they're going to move towards Eastern Europe as well, until eventually the bigger communities are going to be in areas of Poland and Ukraine and Russia. Okay, but right now we're in the period of 500 to about 1100. So what's going on in Judaism? Jews are being exiled. We're not the strongest at this point in history. There's one base of Gemara happening in Iraq. Now, if you are a Jew who just moved to Spain, you just moved to Spain in the year 800. How do you get your halacha questions answered? There's probably not that many rabbis yet. When communities begin, it takes time for the communities to get strong enough. Once they get strong enough, they start raising enough money, then they might bring in their first rabbis to answer questions. But if it's the year 900 right now, easy question for you. It's the year 900, and you have a halacha question, and now you're living in Toledo. How do you get your question answered?
Well, didn't Rambam live in Spain? I don't know if it was at the time, but
Not yet. Rambam is going to be like 300 years later, and that's when Spain is going to become the next main base. The communities become rich enough, and the Muslims in that time are going to be peaceful enough that we're actually going to build an empire there of Torah. And in Babylonia, Iraq is going to go down in its power, and Spain is going to rise. And then France is going to rise. And eventually, hundreds of years later, Poland is going to rise. So places are going to move around. But right now, you're not the golden age of Spain. You're not in the times of the Rambam. You're 400 years earlier. There might be a couple of young rabbis looking for a job, but nobody is a posek. A posek means a halacha guy, an arbiter, a person who knows how to answer halacha. So there's no poskim, there's no posek living in Spain right now that can really answer the hard, tough questions. And there's a lot of tough questions. We're going to have life and death questions. We're going to have health questions. We're going to have Shabbat questions. Should be very complicated. How does business questions on Shabbat? And in those days, the world was still more religious than it is today. I mean, today, I'd say in the last couple hundred years, since like the 1700s or so, Jews could decide if they want to be traditional or not traditional. You can really decide how much do I want to keep things, how much do I not want to keep things. But those days, I would say that, the world was so divided based on religion, and especially outside religions that were more in control viewed Judaism from the perspective of you are Jews. So once you're a Jew, you got to be part of your community, because the only way you're going to be safe is if your community takes care of you. Now, it's funny when I'm saying over ideas that I've said in the past, but as in a situation in Israel, a lot of this stuff still makes sense nowadays. It's funny, you think we've evolved into something a little bit greater where the tribalism is weaker, but it's not true. The tribalism, the need for a community is probably just as strong today as it was back then. But back then you have your community, and you're a Jew in your community, and you wanted to be a good Jew. How observant you were, okay, everybody was different, but you probably wanted to try. So who do you ask your question to, or how do you ask a question if there's nobody knowledgeable yet? Any ideas? Anybody? Who do you ask your question to? Okay, fine. Easier question. Yuda, today, if you have a halacha question, what do you do today if you have a halacha question? How do you get your question answered? Yuda,
You call a rabbi?
Call a rabbi. Okay, excellent. Call a rabbi. Awesome. So good. Back then, could they call a rabbi?
No, they didn't have phones, or you're saying that it also
No
didn't
phones
have
back then.
rabbis.
We're like the year 800 right now. But what could you do if you had a question for a rabbi?
Mail him a letter.
You can mail him a letter. Exactly. You could send him a letter. And we have some of those letters that they sent to the rabbis. We have actually books that were compiled. So we said, where are the big rabbis in the year 800? They're living in Iraq. So you are now a new young community living in Spain, and you have a question. So what do? You send a letter to the rabbi to ask a question. Now, a lot of times back then, you'd also send a little bit of money, because you always want to support the yeshivas. That's always been a Jewish tradition. And also, if you move to Spain as a young person, you're probably going there to make a lot of money. So maybe you are being successful if you're working hard enough. So you send a little money back, and you want to ask a question and support the community, support the yeshivas, and ask a question to the rabbi. So what would you do? You would send a letter. But back then, how do you send a letter? There's no email back then. There's no WhatsApp messaging right now. You can't send a text message. You got to send an actual written letter. There's no printing press yet. So you're writing it down with a scribe, writing it out. Now, Jews are pretty literate, so we're pretty good with our alphabet. We're writing our letter, and we send it. Now, how do you send it? So if you're in Spain, you got to go, basically, you got to send it as people are traveling. Now, people, they wouldn't just travel on their own. They would only travel in groups for safety purposes, and you'd hire guards, and you'd hire that, and every step along the way, you got to pay taxes for people to take your stuff through where it's going. So they'll send it down from Spain. They're going to go through Morocco, and they're going to start going through Africa. And every step along the way, you would stop in the main cities. You would stop in the Moroccan cities. You stop in the Tunisian cities. You'd stop in Egypt for a bit. You might make it through. You might make it through Israel. You might go through some other paths, but eventually, it would make it to Iraq, to the big rabbis in Iraq. They would get the letter. They would answer the letter. Then they would send back the responses. And again, this would take time, because you got to wait till people are traveling. They say it could take 6 months to a year to get a response for one of your letters that you ask. So they probably would save up a bunch of good questions. They get their letter back, and we have stories of what would happen when you get your letter back. And they would say that people would jump for joy. Praise God. Oh my God. My letter just made it back. The rabbi, the great Gaonim, they were called Gaonim in Iraq. The great Gaonim, Rav Saadia Gaon, answered my question. And they said they would invite the whole community, and they would come to the synagogue. They'd come to the shul, and they would get together in the synagogue, in the Beit Knesset, and they would bring the letter on a silk pillow, and they would walk it in, and they would dance, and they would sing, and then they would read the letter once and twice. And that was their Torah. When they became rich enough, they would start to bring in some books as well. But this was the new modern day Torah. They just got a letter from the big rabbis. And whatever younger rabbis were in Spain would start to read the letter over and over again. And they would learn, and they would start to build their rabbis in these new countries. But that was an unbelievable concept of how excited people were just to get a response for halacha. At the same time, those rabbis back in Iraq that were answering the questions, what did they do? They started to compile books of those answers, and then you can rewrite those books and send them out there so people could learn those halachas and learn modern halacha based on what they were writing down. So today, we have access to those books. So you guys as Bar Ilan students now on the Shoot Bar Ilan website, which through your student IDs you can get to, we have access to these books that answer these original questions. Now that is known as responsa. What's responsa? Responsa sounds like responses. Responsa is known as Q&A. Anybody know how to say responsa in Hebrew? This genre of books. Anybody know how to say it in Hebrew? The word is actually is easier in Hebrew than it is in English. The responsa literature, the responsa books. Anybody know?
Is it chuvot?
Close. It's she'elot uchuvot. It's known as questions and answers. Q&A books. So for the next 500 years, the only books of halacha that are really being written are Q&A books, where people could organize, see from the year 500 to around 1100, they're writing Q&A books to update halacha to whatever's happening in their time zones. A lot of business, those that want to be business majors, a lot of business halachot about how to keep Shabbat, how to hire non-Jews to work for you. Yeah, Sammy.
How would they get their answer back if it took them 6 years?
No, it would take about 6 months to a year.
Oh, okay.
But it was a long time. It was a long time. So it wasn't necessarily the life and death questions, although a lot of times they would ask old questions just to finally get an answer. Meaning we had this thing in our city, we didn't know what to do, we did XYZ. Was that right or was that wrong? That could also be the question that they were asking, just so they don't know for the future of how to do it. But it would take a lot of time.
Would they get punished if they did the wrong thing?
Good question. In the Shemaim, I think it works as follows. You got to try your best, and you got to try to base it off of something with the best of your ability in the city that you have. So the answer, I think, I don't think that there would be, it's not called, first off, if it's called a sin, it's called not on purpose, which already is a different category. But if you really are using your sources and trying your best, that's the rabbis of your generation. Now, what are you not allowed to do? You're not allowed to be lazy. Like today, when you can WhatsApp any rabbi anywhere in the world, I have alumni that are WhatsApping me questions every single day now. To WhatsApp questions is very easy. So to say that I have no one to ask, that's not a good answer. To say that I've asked, and this is the best they can come up with, then you are safe. If you actually ask a question and that rabbi got it wrong, then you are not to blame for that, and then you're not responsible. If that rabbi got it wrong because he was being negligent, that's a problem. If he got it wrong because that was the best of his ability, then no, I don't think there would be any kind of punishment, any kind of issue with that. Okay, fine. Then, as we're getting into the year 1100, we start getting into what's called the Rishonim, the early rabbis. The early rabbis are the famous ones that you know. That's the Rashi and the Rambams and the Rashbams and the Tosfots and the Rashbas. You might have heard these names. These are like the famous rabbis that they're starting to write much more. At this point in history, halacha has left Iraq. Iraq is much weaker right now. And now the centers of halacha are basically in the Sephardic Jewry in Spain and by Ashkenazi Jewry in France and Germany. These are the major now centers of halacha. They've already hired big rabbis, brought in a lot of books, and they're starting to write. No, they're still writing responsa. We're still getting the question and answer books, but they also start for the first time to write compilation books, compendiums, codes of law, big books that organize the law very easy. Because while Gemara talks about everything, it's very complicated because it talks about everything. And when you talk about everything, it's hard to follow. And it works based on precedence. So in one topic, in the book of Shabbat, they might start talking about the laws of planting, and they might start talking about the laws of marriage, because there's some kind of legal principle that's the same in both cases, even though the laws are not connected at all practically. So what the rabbis started to do, they start to write books where they organize the mitzvot so it's clear for everybody. The truth of the matter, historically, the whole world is doing this. The whole world, the non-Jewish world as well, is creating legal books for countries and for governments, because people are getting a little bit better at reading, at least the men, and they want to know how to do things. They want to understand how to do things properly. So now we're going to have our first books of the mitzvot, where all 613 commandments are going to be written and it'll be clear. And then the Rambam, Maimonides, or Moshe ben Maimon, living in Spain, but eventually he's going to flee for his life and he's going to move down and become a major doctor and physician for the Sultan in Egypt, he himself is going to write what's known as the Mishnah Torah. He's going to write a Sefer Mitzvot, a book of mitzvahs that goes through all 16, but then he's going to write his main book, which is the Mishnah Torah, where he's going to go through all the laws, both the Torah commandments and the rabbinic commandments, puts it in one book, makes it clear, unbelievably. Anybody know how many chapters are in his book? We only discovered this hundreds of years later, how his brain was so clear. Anybody know how many chapters was in the Rambam's book? He was known as the codifier because he was so clear and so concise and so straight in how he did it. His book is made up of 1,000 chapters. To have a book that's so many pages long, that's so organized, that's so complex, but to be so organized numerically, in those days when when it was being written by hand, it just shows you where he was. And you have to realize he was spending most of his week, 8 to 10 hours a day, traveling back and forth from the Jewish community to the Sultan of Egypt and being a doctor. The guy was unbelievable, and he wrote this book. He also wrote, for those of you that are philosophy majors, he wrote his Mor Nevuchim, his Guide to the Perplexed, which was also a major philosophical work, which you could just see his depth of knowledge when it came to Greek philosophy, Romans, and the rest, and as well as Arabic philosophy and Arabic poetry. He was a superstar. But his book of Mishnah Torah, what's important for our class, it was the first really clear halacha book that covered everything. Any Yemenites in the room? Yemenites, I know we asked last week, but any Yemenites in the room? Yemenites? Raise your hand if you're Yemenites. Okay, Yemenites in the room. Okay, Yemenites. Do you know Shami or Baladi? You guys know what that even means?
Yeah, man.
Okay, in Amman, you guys go like the Rambam with everything, or you go like the Shulchan Aruch?
Rambam.
Rambam people, you guys boil your chicken before you eat it?
Nah, but we pretend like we do.
You gotta love Americans. Okay, great, awesome. No, very good. So the Yemenites, till today, there's a big group of Yemenites till today that are still Rambam people. The Rambam himself used to wrote them special letters, was very close to the community. Their rabbi studied him so much that today, while the rest of the Jewish people kind of moved in other directions in halacha, they're still like, this Rambam was so great till today, we're still going to do like the Rambam. Okay. Then other rabbis wrote books. Another important one was the Tur. The Tur was a rabbi whose family was originally from Ashkenaz, but they had fled to Spain. The Rosh was his father. They also wrote books of halacha. One of them was known as the Tur Shulchan Aruch. You don't have to know this for this class. Just realize other books were being written. Now we're going to fast forward because a terrible tragedy happened to the Jewish people. We'd already been exiled once. We've been exiled twice. We're traveling around the world right now. But now Muslim Spain fell and became Christian Spain, and Christian Spain decided to hate the Jews a lot and exiled the big, strong community of Spain. 1492 kicks out the Jewish people, the Great Expulsion, and the Jews are now fleeing. We have refugees going all over. They're running to Ashkenaz. The Ashkenazi community as well right now in the 1500s now has expanded to Eastern Europe. Sephardic Jews are running throughout Northern Africa, to Israel, to Greece becomes a big point for them as well, to Iraq. Everyone's just running away. Syria, everyone's running away. And we have this major exile, this major refugees. People are feeling terrible about themselves. God has hurt the Jewish people again. They don't know what to do. But 100 years go by, or a little bit less than a generation goes by, and they start to rebuild. And there's a local community living in Tzfat, living in Israel. Bezrat Hashem, when we get to Israel, guys, we're going to take you to Tzfat for a Shabbat. And it's a special community because it has refugees from everywhere. Svardim, Ashkenazim are there too. Everybody's there. You have the old school Israelis that have been living in Israel who had never left. Everyone's there in Tzfat together. These are the biggest rabbis of the generation, and all types of rabbis. Halacha people, Kabbalah, the Arizal is living there. Rav Luria, who's going to be the major commentator on the Kabbalah, is living there. We have great darshanim on the parasha that are going to explain the parasha and great divrei Torah. Tzfat is the main base for Judaism in Israel. And there's a rabbi there known as Rav Yosef Karo. Rav Yosef Karo, his family originally had fled from Spain 100 years earlier, but less earlier. He's living in Tzfat. He's a big rabbi, big Talmid Chacham. And he starts to write a book. And the book that he writes is known as the Shulchan Aruch. Because what he's doing is he's living in Sfat, and he's noticing there's people that have come from everywhere, refugees from everywhere, people from all different countries, people who want to live in Israel, and they have different customs. And it's getting complicated because because it's not all the same, because over the years, people have developed in different kind of directions. So he says, you know what? I got to make one simple law for everybody. There have been too many commentators over the last couple hundred years, and people are saying, I'm a Maimonides person, I'm a Rosh person, I'm a Rashi person. It's getting too complicated. Let me take the main rabbis, and for him, the main rabbis were the main Sephardic rabbis, which is going to be a little bit of a critique that's going to come from the Ashkenazi countries. Let me take the main Sephardic rabbis, and I'm going to go with majority rule. And he writes what's known as the Shulchan Aruch, where he, based on previous books, the Tur and the Rambam, he writes a simple halacha book, but he cuts out all the laws that don't apply. The Rambam's book spoke about everything. It spoke about the Beit HaMikdash laws, the sacrifice laws, things that did not apply in the exile. The Shulchan Aruch cut all that out. Actually, the Tur before him already did that, but he basically cuts out all the laws that no longer apply and just writes the laws that are practical for a Jew living in Israel in 1563. And he writes this book of simple Jewish law. And over the next couple hundred years, everybody loves it. It's great. And especially the Sephardic Jews, everybody starts saying, you know what? We like this. And everybody accepts it, basically. You know, and if you're a Jew living in Morocco, you're a Jew living in Greece, you're a Jew living in Syria and Iraq, when you get this book, you love it so much, whatever your custom was in your local community, you don't care anymore. This becomes the new Sephardic custom. But at the same time, his book gets traveling around, and it makes it to Ashkenaz. It makes it to Europe, and it makes it to Poland. And now Poland has a massive Jewish community. And it makes it to the city of Krakow, to the rabbi named Rav Moshe Isserlis, known as the Ramah. The Ramah is the big rabbi in Krakow, and he gets the book. Now, how does the book make it to Poland? Maybe you know. How does the book make it to Poland? Now, you should know, at this point in history, we finally have printing presses. And the Shulchan Aruch is one of the first generations of halacha books, or books in general, that was being printed. And he understood technology so well that he's even organizing it in a way with a numbering system, and next he knows it's going to be printed, and he's ready for this book to be really accepted. But how did a book like his make it to Poland? Any ideas?
It came with merchants, maybe bringing it to trade.
Excellent. It comes with merchants. Good. Excellent. Excellent. There was major trade happening. And I actually was listening to a lecture at Bar Ilan about the Yemenite Jews, that in Yemen, they were actually very big in business, especially the coffee business. A lot of coffee beans came from Yemen. Till today, even there's a big business there of coffee, and everybody wanted coffee. It was a great stimulant. It kept people awake at night. And once they were able to, I think the coffee bean originally came from, I could be wrong about this, but I think it originally came from the New World. But somehow they planted in Yemen, becomes major business, and the Jewish community there was very rich. The Jewish community there, the Jewish community in Iraq, and they're making money with the merchandise and then sending money to buy Torah, because once you have money, now you want to become knowledgeable, now you want to be intellectual, now you want to study, you want to be a good Jew. So they actually were sending a lot of money to Israel. So one way is merchants just traveling, and while they're traveling, they're bringing books with them. Another way, which I think happens until today, is fundraising. The Jewish community in Israel was always poor. It's only really in the last 20 years, with Israel being a startup nation, that for the first time, I don't know, in centuries and centuries and centuries, we're not that poor little country anymore. Although, right now we're in a war. Every penny that's coming to us from America, from Canada, from Europe, all the Jews that are sending us money right now to Israel, is actually a really big deal. So we still rely a lot on fundraising from Jews in the more business-oriented parts of the world, even till today. But it's in the last 20 years, it's for the first time become a little bit less. We're going to see if this war takes us back 20 years. But in general, it's been hard. Living financially here was never easy. Also, people here tended to always be a little bit more, living a more, I would say, religious style lifestyle, where they were okay with being poor because they wanted to spend more time studying, more time learning. So part of what took place was there was fundraising. There was fundraising for the poor people of Israel, for the yeshivas of Israel. So what happens? And this happens till today when somebody comes out there to America, Canada, over there to fundraise. The rabbi from Israel comes to the shul. Okay, Yehuda. Let's try somebody else. Actually, Nisim, you with us? We got Nisim over here. Nisim. Yosef, you with me?
I'm here.
Okay, Nisim here. Okay, Nisim. If you're a rabbi from Israel who's going fundraising, so you're a rabbi from Israel and you now go to Brooklyn to go fundraise because you heard that the Jews of Brooklyn, they like to donate money. That's what you heard. So you now come to Brooklyn, you land in Brooklyn. How do you raise money for the poor people of Israel or for the yeshivas of Israel? Anybody here want to be a fundraiser? Nobody wants to be a fundraiser, right?
You sell books.
You sell books. Okay, good. You sell books. Excellent, Judah. I'd say something a little bit simpler than that. You give out books. You come to where you are, and the first thing you do is you go to the rabbi of the shul. You go to the shul. You go to the community. Where's the rabbi of the shul? You go up to the main rabbi. Hi, rabbi. I am so and so, and I'm an emissary from the yeshiva in Israel. Is there anybody here who wants to support Jewish people in Israel? So what does the rabbi say? Yeah, of course. We love Israel in our shul. I have my little rabbi fund on the side, but also that rich guy over there, that he loves supporting Jewish causes. And you say, thank you, Rabbi. And then what do? You say, Rabbi, here's a book. This is from my rabbi in Israel, Rav Yosef Karo in Sfat. You've heard of him? Of course we've heard of him. That's the big rabbi in Sfat. Here's the book that he wrote on halacha. We want to give this to you as a present. And then you go to the rich guy, thank you for the donation. Here's a present from our rabbi in Israel. So that's one way that books make it to Poland. Another interesting way for books to make it places is how would you print books in the old days? It wasn't like today. Today there's many printing. Printing shops. There's many. We say in Hebrew, Beit HaTifus. We have many printing areas. In those days, not only was it expensive and there were very few, there was also, at least in Europe, a Christian censor. And the Christians, they wanted to know everything that was being written by everybody to make sure there wasn't anything against Christianity. And they had Jews that had become Christians who would read through every Jewish book and look for anything that could be anti-Christian. So what do? They set up a couple of places, not many. They set up a couple of places, primarily in Italy, where anybody who wanted to print anything would go to print their books. And to print books, it costs. You had to first raise money to do it. You had to go to the printing area. You had to go to the printing areas, and to put all that together, it took time. It took money, and at the same time, rabbis would meet each other, and they would sit and they would share books with each other because you're in the same city for 6 months trying to print your book. And that's another way that books started getting places. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch, this book of halacha, which clarified, was practical, it was modern. It makes it to Rav Moshe Isserles in Krakow. Now, Rav Moshe Isserles did something unbelievable. The Ramah sees this book and says, wow, I was actually writing a very similar book about halacha, about what we do here in Krakow. But this book already did it, or already made it very simple. So in an act of unbelievable humility, he stops writing his book and instead writes notes on the Shulchan Aruch where he says, you know what? These halachot look pretty good, but every couple halachot, there's things that we do a little bit differently here. There's other rabbis that come from France, that come from Germany, that come from Poland, that we do more like. Meaning, when there was that question about how to light Hanukkah candles, Maimonides was one approach, but the Tosfot, he had a different approach. So let's rewrite, let's write a book, or let's add the notes of Ashkenazi halacha into this book. And now in one book, what do you have? Both the Sephardic halacha and the Ashkenazi halacha. So he actually called his notes the Mapah. The Mapah means the tablecloth, because Shulchan Aruch means the set table. So the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo wrote a table, and he wrote the tablecloth where he added where the Ashkenazi halacha differed from the Sephardic halacha. And this book now became accepted halacha until today. If anybody wants to be a rabbi today, this is the main primary book of law you have to read. There are some Yemenites who will use the Rambam as more primary, but even in the Yemenites, they're split. But for the vast majority of Jews, and even the Yemenites today who want to become rabbis, you're going to spend a lot of time reading the Shulchan Aruch, because in one book, you have both laws. Unbelievable. Now, on the other hand, it did something different. Because who's to say that all Ashkenazim did like what he was doing in Poland? It could easily be that in Germany, they say there were a lot of laws that were like more similar to the Sephardic halacha. It's not so simple that this is Sephardic halacha and this is Ashkenazi halacha. So it took a couple of 100 years, but basically what this book did, on the one hand, it was one book, so we have unity in one book. On the other hand, it solidified Sephardic and Ashkenazi halacha until today. Meaning, before this book, we could debate what is Sephardic halacha, what is Ashkenazi halacha, and we can start to change it a little bit. But once this book became accepted, it became the bottom line Sephardic and Ashkenazi halacha, ignoring every other Sephardic and Ashkenazi rabbi who might have argued on what's written in this book. So on the one hand, we have unity, we have one book for almost everybody. On the other hand, we have division because it's it's now solidified two communities in the Jewish people. Now, throughout Jewish history, throughout halacha, we're going to have this back and forth. How much do we keep with my local custom, and how much do we unify custom? You know, like now with the state of Israel, and now Jews coming in from everywhere into Israel. So Ashkenazi halacha after 1563 became a little bit different. You have yourself the German halacha, you have yourself the Lithuanian halacha, you have the Polish halacha. But after World War II, that kind of like, stopped existing so much because they unified. Sephardic halacha. Moroccans do things differently than Syrians do things, than Iraqis do things. But the truth of the matter is, now we're starting to create Israeli halacha. And in real truth, we're starting to create what's today Israeli halacha versus American halacha. The new different communities right now, while there is a Sephardic Ashkenazi divide until today, and a Yemenite a little bit as well, the bigger change in history right now is the difference between American halacha and Israeli halacha. Okay, so let's fast forward. So this book becomes very popular, it becomes unbelievable, becomes awesome. Then from 1563 until today, the main things that are happening in halacha is that there's more responsa, more question and answer books are being written, and now we have hundreds and hundreds of books of Q&A, and then commentaries happening on the Shulchan Aruch, with different rabbis giving their interpretations and modernizing the halacha. The most famous in the Ashkenazi world being the Mishnah Brura, although there's other good books that were written too as well. The Chabadnikim in the room, Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Aruch HaShulchan, other good books are being written as well, but commentaries for the most part are being written on the Shulchan Aruch. And then in today's time, the big thing that's happening are guidebooks. Today, take any little tiny topic and somebody will write, I have in my house right now, kippah. We're going to talk about kippah later in the semester. Is it halacha? Is it custom? Like, what is this thing we put on our heads? Today, you could find a 500-page book on kippahs, which on the one hand, it's funny how detailed we get. On the other hand, it's what we're doing today, guidebooks in Hebrew and in English that go through every little detail of halacha. And I would say that today is probably the most popular, although Q&A for all of the big stuff or the real most modern parts of halacha today is what's known as instant halacha that's taking place through WhatsApp and through websites and online and social media. And books today are being written based on social media questions, because today you can ask questions about every little detail of our lives, and nothing is embarrassing anymore to ask because you can ask it anonymously online. Nobody will ever know who you are. So the stuff we can write about today that we're not scared to write about today is actually unbelievable from a legal perspective. Okay, guys, questions on anything? I said a lot. It was a little bit more history today. Next week, I actually want to go through halacha, actual laws, and it's going to be total different style next week because we're going to get nitty gritty in how to wake up in the morning. So those that like history, I hope you enjoyed it. Those that don't like history, don't worry. Next week, we're going to get legal in what we're doing. But any questions? For those listening online late, please reminder to send me a message that you listened to this class, and then I'll add you. Give me like a one line what you learned from something you learned in the class, and then I'll add you for the attendance if you weren't today. Oh, anybody that's on the call right now, if you could write your name in the chat, so that way we get you for attendance. But any questions? Questions? Okay, guys. Awesome. Write your name in the chat, and it says there were 24 of you here, so 24 names in there, and awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sorry, let me just leave real quick. Bye.
No, no.